What exactly is a macro, and why should you care? A macro in Unreal Blueprints is basically a way to bundle multiple nodes into a single reusable node. Imagine you have 5 nodes working together to perform a task. Instead of repeating those 5 nodes every time, you pack them into a macro and just use one node. This is useful for keeping your code clean and simple. But macros aren't just about tidiness. They come with their own perks and quirks. Epic Games even gives us some handy macros out of the box. For example, the do once node. It does exactly what it sounds like. Let some code run only one time, even if it's called every tick until you reset it. Pretty simple to use, right? Well, let's see what the do once actually consists of. That's a lot of code for a simple do once. Instead of manually creating all this every time you want to use a do once, you just use the macro, saving tons of time and effort. That's why macros are so powerful for repetitive or complex logic. You build them once and reuse them endlessly. You can also copy and paste to other classes. Another default macro you get is increment int. It's a small but useful one. There's also a macro inside the macro. Macroception. Making your own macro is super straightforward. If it's not visible, make sure that my blueprint is enabled. You start with input and output sections, where you can add pins of any variable type. There are also 2 special pin options, one being an execution pin, which is the same as this. The second option is called Wildcard, which is like a chameleon. It can accept almost any variable type. Wildcards are fantastic when you want a macro to work flexibly without locking down a specific type. I always start my macros with an input and output value. Alright, so for example, I want to create a macro that waits until a condition is met before continuing. Instead of using a branch and checking, then connecting back to the delay, I want to do this in a macro, since code can get very messy if we have a bunch of delays and branches everywhere. In this scenario, I want to wait until all enemies are dead before starting wave 2. This would be the default way to do it. You can customize your macro with a name, color, and description for clarity. While you could use a wildcard here, wildcards have limited options when it comes to comparing values. I'll just add the same code as before. For testing purposes, I will set the condition to be true after a few seconds. You also have the option to store local variables. So instead of creating new variables in your class, you can store and use them temporarily in the macro. You can see this being in use in the do once macro. Let me show you another example. Say you want to pick up ammo, and you have to make sure that the ammo doesn't exceed its maximum capacity. In this case, I will set that value to be 100. The default way to do it would be to add ammo, check if it's above 100, and if it is, set it to be 100. But you might want to do this not just for ammo, maybe for health, stamina, or ability charges. So creating a macro to handle this logic is smarter. I'll set it as a float because it works for both floats and integers. First, I'll add the value to check. Then I'll add max as an input so that I can decide the max value depending on what I'm using this for. I'll add a clamp output just to know that it needs to be clamped here. That works well. And we can even use it for other things. Not only that, but I can make it even more efficient. Here I've got the same setup, but I'm using it for health instead. So instead of adding and going through this annoying part, you can do it inside the macro. We can also remove one of the exec pins. We can't set the input directly, but what we can do is assign the value like this. We'll also need to add using the add node. Add another input to decide how much to add by. As you can see, there is not output on the assign. So how do we set the result? We can use the input because we change its value before the result. I've swapped the ammo for health. It works perfectly, and it's even more efficient than before. These are some examples of what macros can do, but you can check out my next macro video to discover even more.